Joining us now is Humberto Fontova, who brought this up in a recent article he wrote. Humberto, thank you, and welcome back to the Savage Nation. Well, what are they doing here? Why would they permit a mass murderer's daughter to go there and ban Michael Savage?
No, the thing that amazed me is that right around the time that you were banned in Britain, right around just a couple of weeks in advance of that, or following that ban, Aleida Guevara, Che Guevara's daughter, was being welcomed with a red carpet treatment into the very nation that was banning Michael Savage for his hate speech. Now, some people might say, well, good grief, Humberto, it's the guy's daughter. The guy's been dead 40 years. This is the guy's daughter. How can you possibly... Well, but Aleida Guevara was going there, by her own admission, to propagate her father's ideals.
No.
That's the amazing part. Britain, London, the very place that was banning Michael Savage for his so-called hate speech, was throwing a gigantic celebration, celebrating, with a gigantic fiesta, the 50th anniversary of Castro and Che Guevara's Stalinist regime. Folks, we're talking about a regime that jailed political prisoners at a higher rate than Stalin's own, that murdered, I almost said execute, but execution implies some form of judicial process, whereas we have it from Aleida's own father, how his executions took place. He said, judicial evidence is an archaic bourgeois detail. We execute by revolutionary or from revolutionary conviction. So in other words, this regime murdered more men and boys, and some women. By the way, they were way ahead of the Taliban in certain respects. Cuban Archives Project, and I have this fully documented in my books, they document like about a dozen women, one of them pregnant, executed by firing squad in Cuba in the early 60s. But in other words, this regime, capable of all of these things that I'm telling you, was being welcomed with open arms, representatives of this regime, in London by the same people who were banning so-called hate speech.
Unbelievable.
The amazing thing is that hate speech nowadays, has an extremely elastic definition, but it's primarily used when somebody says something that might even imply, a negative attitude towards a racial minority or a racial group or a certain sexual orientation and so forth. Well, here's what the regime that Britain threw out the red carpet for did in the mid-'60s. Here is what Aleida's father did in the mid-'60s. They rounded up in Cuba gays and what they called rockeros, rockers, long hairs.
Why?
Because in the mid to early 60s, it was a crime to try to listen to rock and roll music in Cuba. It was, even though a lot of what people were trying to listen to were, in fact, British bands, the Stones, the Kinks, the Beatles, and so forth, it was all considered by the regime as Yankee imperialist music. And so what would happen is that the regime rounded up tens of thousands of Cuban youths, long hairs, and anyone who had effeminate characteristics or mannerisms were rounded up en masse and thrown into forced labor camps that were called UMAP. The initials were UMAP, U-M-A-P. Not exactly the initials for Gulag, but the conditions in them were practically identical. Many dozens of men and boys, youths primarily, died, were beaten to death, and so forth. And like I say, they concentrated on youths. All cities and so forth have areas where gay people are known to congregate. Well, the Castro regime would surround these areas with military trucks. Soldiers would go out with machine guns and so forth, and herd everyone in these areas into trucks and dump them in forced labor camps. And by the way, the camps had, at the gate, when they walk in, they had a big sign that said, I interviewed a lot of the former inmates of these places who are now living in freedom in the United States and not afraid to tell the truth, not afraid of Castro's torture chambers anymore. And the sign in the front of these camps as you walked in, it said, work will make men out of you. Which is interesting because Auschwitz had a big sign in front that said, work will set you free.
Oh, my God.
And I also interviewed people who went to high school. And as a matter of fact, my father went to University of Havana at the same time as Fidel Castro. They're the same age, but my dad's in much better health. And Castro was always a keen student of fascist and Nazi paraphernalia. Mussolini primarily because of his Latin heritage. But it's no coincidence among those of us who know Cuban history that Castro's most famous speech is titled, History Will Absolve Me. He gave this speech and he wrote a book with that title back in 1953 when he was first arrested. Well, that also happens to be the most famous quote by Adolf Hitler after the beer hall putsch. It's the same thing. So again, I repeat, this is the regime that was being celebrated in Britain at the same time that they were banning Mr. Michael Savage for so-called hate speech. Hate speech is one thing to insinuate something, but what about when it takes the literal form, not of speech, but hate actions, as in herding gays into forced labor camps, beating some of them to death, starving others to death, and here's a woman coming to Britain to celebrate these things. In her own words, she was going there to celebrate her father's ideals. Well, those were her father's ideals. They are fully documented.
That's crazy. Sorry, crazy.
You reach a point where you almost have to develop a sense of humor about the hypocrisy. You want to think that ignorance accounts for a lot to it, but no, it's been 50 years. People have been saying and writing about these atrocities for 50 years. But what happened is that the left, the liberals, had a monopoly on the mainstream media, so it was difficult for these items to penetrate the mainstream media filter because we were bad-mouthing the left's premier poster boys, Fidel Castro and Che Guevara.
But the media darlings didn't go out of the way that Hollywood portrayed, though, did they?
Oh, no. As a matter of fact, the amazing thing about these last two movies, because it's really one movie, but it's separated into two because of the length. The 4-hour movie by Steven Soderbergh and by Benicio del Toro, Che Guevara. In fact, you can pretty much say that the primary mentor, screenwriter for that movie was none other than Fidel Castro, because it is based on Che Guevara's diaries. This is according to Steven Soderbergh himself, the director. We wanted to be sure that the movie was historically accurate, so they base it on Che's diaries, which were in fact edited by Castro's propaganda ministry, and in fact the very foreword to these diaries were written by Fidel Castro himself. And Benicio del Toro and Steven Soderbergh visited Havana often, and in fact, thanked the you say these things you can't believe, and they sat there, and this is on record. They thanked Castro and his propaganda ministry. They didn't call it propaganda, but that's what it was, for helping them so much with the movie. I have to remind myself, how old I am, and I have to remind myself that the Soviet Union or that the East Bloc, the Iron Curtain, fell over 20 years ago, because there's no way that while I was growing up, people would take seriously something that was produced in conjunction with the propaganda ministry of a Soviet-aligned nation. No one would have believed this, but now apparently a lot of people are. The movie has not done well, but not because of its historical inaccuracy, although it's a historical joke, because of its dramatic qualities, which I guess is saying something.
Humberto Fontova, thanks really much for being on the Savage Nation.
It's always great to have the Michael Savage Show to try to get the truth out about what's going on in a Stalinist regime and what went on by these Stalinists just 90 miles from U.S. shores. Thanks again, buddy.